Hello everybody. In the previous video we took a very quick look at some things that you can do before you start animating that will make it more difficult to break your rig. So in this video we're going to create a walk cycle for this character that we see here. And the first thing you're going to want to think about before even starting your walk cycle is, do you want it to be a fast walk? Do you want it to be a slow walk? Is it going to be a more average speed walk? What kind of walk are you going to want to do? Now, for this video, we're going to be doing a average paced walk. It's not going to be a slow walk. It's not going to be a fast walk. It's going to be a pretty normal speed. And to that end, I'm going to set my timeline to 24 frames. In fact, I'm going to make the beginning at frame 0 rather than 1 for this particular example. So 24 frames, that's going to be 1 second. And in that 1 second, I'm going to make the character take 2 steps. And that'll create a pretty normal paced walk. If I wanted to make a faster walk, maybe I'd have my character take 2 steps in 16 frames. Or if I wanted my character to do a slower walk, maybe I would make him take his 2 steps in 36 frames, just as examples. Now, one other thing I'd like to emphasize before I begin is that we're going to be creating a walk cycle. So I'm going to make an animation of my character taking 2 steps, but because it's a cycle, it will be an animation that can be played over and over and over again, so that we could bring this animation into a game, for instance, and when the player uses their joystick to make the character go forward, it'll play this walk animation, and when the player releases the joystick, the character will stop walking. That it's an animation that can be played over and over again. And then one other thing I'd like to emphasize is that I'm going to be animating the character more or less walking in place. Think of it as if the character were walking on a treadmill. However, another approach would be to actually animate the character walking forward, and we might take a look at that as an example as well. So let's begin. I think the first thing I'll do is just lean my character forward a little bit, giving him more of a sense of maybe momentum moving forward. Walking is actually described oftentimes as controlled falling. So we'll make him a little bit off balance here, leaning forward, giving him perhaps a little more forward momentum. And then the second thing we'll do is start posing the feet here. So I'll select the right leg and I'll go ahead and just bring it back. And we'll take the left leg and move it forward. Now, this particular rig has what is called the stretchy leg setup, and I might not actually want the legs to stretch like this, so I'm going to bring the hips down a little bit to the point where perhaps the legs start to bend just a little bit, ever so slightly here. So now that we have the character partially posed here for our walk, let's go ahead and set some keys. So I'll select the 2 foot controls or leg controls, and I'm going to key them on frame 0. And I'll key them on frame 24 as well, because the first frame of my animation is going to be identical to the last frame of the animation, so that it properly cycles. Okay. Now we'll go directly in between to frame 12, and I'll bring the left foot back and we'll bring the right foot forward. Notice that I'm putting them in the same position. I'm putting, in this case, the right foot in the same position on the Z translate here as the left leg was at frame 0 and 24. Okay, let's go ahead and select those two controls and key them, and let's see what we have so far. So if I play this, we have this. Another thing that we can start thinking about is what is called the passing position on a walk. So I'm going to go to the beginning of my animation. I'll pick the right leg here. And we know that when the right leg, in this case, when it goes forward to go to frame 12, that the character is going to need to lift his leg. Otherwise, it's going to look like he's just shuffling along, sliding along the floor, right? So let's go ahead and grab the leg, and perhaps I'll rotate it a little bit. What's interesting is that typically when people walk, they actually don't lift their feet very high, which is why oftentimes we can trip on something as minor as a root on a tree or a crack in the sidewalk. And I'll go ahead and key it. I'm keying the right leg on frame 6. So if we scrub this, you'll see that the leg is going to go, the right foot's going to go up. It comes to the passing position, and then it's going to come over here and plant on the ground. And then it'll slide back here when the foot should be planted on the ground. But now we can go ahead and select the left leg and do something similar. So I'm going to have the left leg planted on the ground, and then when the character starts bringing his foot back forward, we'll go ahead and lift it and maybe rotate it a little bit to make it feel a little more natural, and key it. So now, if we take a look at our animation, we have this. Now, of course, the walk right now looks rather awkward. The character is almost walking more Groucho Marx style without lifting up his hips. There's no up and down on his hips right now. Let's add a little bit of animation on the hips now. So I'm going to go back to my side view, and on frame 0, I'll go ahead and key those hips. Go to frame 24, key it. Go to 12, we'll key it there as well. And then we'll put in some other positions on, once again, on the passing position here. Perhaps on the passing position, we'll raise the hip up, something like that. Key it. And then on this passing position as well, I'll raise the hip up again, and we'll key that as well. And let's see how that looks. Now, the approach that I'm taking to animating this character walking is making the character walk in place, as if, as I said earlier, the character were on a treadmill. However, when it's brought into a game engine, for example, we'll want the character moving forward, and that forward movement will probably be controlled programmatically. It'll be controlled through the code. But we still want to get an idea of what it's going to actually look like moving forward. So I'm going to show you how, using this method of animating the character as if it were on a treadmill, how we can still test it and make sure that the foot placement is working when the character is made to move forward. So let's go ahead and make the character move forward by animating the main controller found here. The main controller on this rig and on most rigs moves everything on the rig. As you can see, if I grab the hip control here, the feet stay planted because they're using IK, but the IK is actually a child of the main control, so it moves with it. I'm going to go to my side view, and here's what we'll do. We're going to figure out how fast that movement should be on that main control to make the feet look as if they're planted on the ground instead of sliding across the ground as they are currently doing. Here's a quick and easy way to do that. So I'm going to take the foot, this left foot, and I'm going to put it right here. I like to use sometimes this as a marker where it says side X on here. I'm going to use that as a marker and put it right at the tip of the toe on the left foot. And I'm going to key that main control on my first frame. And then I'm going to go to frame 12 so that the character takes a full step. And I'm going to simply move the whole main control forward so that the tip of the toe once again is right at this mark here where it says side X here. And I'll key that. And now, if I scrub, you'll see that it looks like the foot is planted on the ground. Let's do that for the second step as well. So I'll just bring my character back here so that the tip of the toe is right here on the, I know it's hard for you to read it, but on my viewport here it says side X. I'm putting the toe of the right foot at the X on there. And I'll scrub in my timeline and we'll move the whole thing forward so that the toe is in the same position as it was on frame 12, and we'll key that. Another way you could do that if you wanted, instead of, I just eyeball it using this method, but if you want to be a little bit more exact, you could go to Create Locator, and you could use that locator to do the same thing. You could place the locator where you need it. Let's see if we can see this locator. Actually, you know what? We cannot see the locator because under Show, I hid everything with the exception of polygons and NURBS curves. But if I click on locators here, then you'll see the locator I just created. And I could use this also to place it as a visual reference if necessary. I'm going to go ahead and delete that, however. And I'll hide locators once again. Okay, let's see what happens now when we play this. I'll go ahead and rewind and play. And what you'll notice is the feet are sliding. If I scrub it, you'll see it's even more prominent. The feet are sliding. And obviously that's not what we want. We want the feet to be planted on the ground. So let's troubleshoot this and figure out what is going on. I'm going to select my main controller. Remember that I just put movement on the Z axis, this forward axis. Let's take a look at that animation channel first. So I'm going to go to my graph editor. And here is that forward movement. And what you'll notice is that we have a slow out at the beginning and a slow in at the end. And since this should be moving at a constant rate, what I'm going to do is get rid of this middle key here. I don't really need that. In fact, I'll go ahead and get rid of the middle key on all those channels. I don't need them. And we're going to eliminate this slow out and slow in. Why? Well, because we want that main controller to consistently move forward at a very constant rate, We don't want it to slow out, slow in. We don't want that staggering movement. So let's go ahead and select this channel here, and what I will do is I will make it linear. This will make the main control move forward at a very constant rate. And we'll go ahead and close that and see if that fixes the problem. And it does not fix the problem. Notice that the feet are still sliding, maybe even worse now. So what's going on? We know that we fixed the main control. Well, slow in, slow out is the default behavior typically when you set keys in Maya. So when we set our keys on these foot controls, they also have slow in, slow out. And oftentimes we want that slow in, slow out. However, we don't want it when the foot is planted on the ground here. So let's go ahead and open up our graph editor again. I currently have the left foot selected. We'll take a look at both the feet and the graph editor at the same time so you can see this. So the left foot is planted from frame 0 currently to frame 12. And as you can see here, on frame 0 to frame 12, we've got a slow out and we have a slow in. I'm going to select these two keys. I'll select the handles on their tangents, this handle and this handle here for this area in between these two keys here, and we'll make those linear as well. So now you can see that the movement of this left foot will be very linear on the translate Z, and then the slow out here might actually work to our advantage. So let's go ahead and scrub this, and you'll see that in fact the left foot is planted, but the right foot still has that same problem. So we simply need to do the same thing on it as well. We'll select it, and then between frames 12 and 24, we'll select those handles and make them linear as well. And now the feet stay planted. So even though we're animating the character walking in place, it's still very useful, in fact necessary, to test it out and make sure if you were to move it forward that the feet won't be sliding. So there we go. That's working now. Let's go ahead and continue with our animation. Now, I like to keep that movement on this control, on the main control, so that I can test it periodically and see how well it looks moving forward. But I don't necessarily want that forward movement on while I'm animating here. So what I'm going to do is not delete those animation keys here, but rather mute them. So if I bring my animation all the way back to the beginning here, frame 0 in this case, and then I select these animated channels here, or in particular the translate Z, that's the one I really need to be concerned with. But if I select those, what I can do is right click on the channels and then say mute selected. And what that will do is it'll keep the animation on that control, but it won't currently play the animation on it. So now, if I play this, you'll see the character is walking in place again. If I want to see the character moving forward again, I'll simply come over to these channels and right click and unmute them. And once again, the character will be moving forward. Let's go ahead and mute those again and continue. I'm going to go back to my side view here and maybe we'll work a little bit more on the feet. So one thing that might be nice with this animation is instead of having the feet come down flat when they come forward, you can see that right now they come down very flat onto uh, the ground here. It might be nice to have something like this, where the foot will come down like this and then boom, come down. So that's what we'll add. We'll add something like that on here now. So in this case, on frame 0 on the left foot, I'm going to go ahead and animate this control. With this particular rig, I could rotate the foot like this, but this one actually has a special control here for getting that animation on the heel. So that's the property I will be animating. Go ahead and rotate that like this. I'm going to key it. I'm going to go to my last frame here, key it again. That way, as this animation cycles, the last frame and the first frame will be identical. And perhaps we'll have it take 2 frames to come down, something like that. And we'll key it. And let's do the same on the right foot as well. So I'm going to key it on frame 0, key it on frame 24. We'll go to frame 12, rotate the foot, key it, and then perhaps 2 frames later, have it come down. Key that as well. Let's take a look at what we have here now. And that's looking a little bit better. Now, throughout this process, this is not a recipe for creating a walk cycle, and there are lots of different approaches to creating a walk cycle. I'm simply showing you one approach that I think is actually really useful for students who are doing their first walk cycle. As you do the animation, think about all those animation principles and all those tools and techniques that you've done up to this point when animating things like a bouncing ball or a pendulum or whatever else you've animated up to this point. One thing with the bouncing ball animations is that we oftentimes went into the graph editor to adjust the animation curves, and we could do the same with this animation of the foot coming down as it is. So one thing I might do with that control selected is go to my graph editor, look at the animation on it, and what I'm going to do is I want it to come down really hard on the ground here. And right now it's happening over 2 frames and it's very equally spaced over those 2 frames. What would happen if I broke the tangent here on this key here, and then grab this handle and just adjust it like this? This will increase the slow out here, in other words, here, and then it'll come down a little bit more abruptly like this. And I'll do the same for the other foot as well. We'll come over here and break that tangent. When the foot comes down here, we'll break that tangent and eliminate that slow in for when the foot comes down. Subtle, but it will help the animation. I can see I'm running into one little problem here. Let's take a look at it. I'm going to go ahead and play this and we'll see how it's looking. Oh, no, I guess it's looking okay, actually. Oh, nope, look at this. This foot obviously is not quite working. Why is that? Well, it came down. I forgot to set a key on that control on frame 12. I'll simply set it to 0 here, and we'll key it now. And that should fix that. That's working now. Perhaps another place where we could add a little bit more to these feet would be here, when the foot comes back. Here, let me select the left leg rather. Foot comes down, goes back, and then we want perhaps the foot to peel off, to do something a little bit more like this. Now, rigs, most rigs are going to be they're going to have very common features, but they might be set up a little bit differently from one another. But oftentimes on a rig that you might be animating, you'll find a control similar to this. It might be called something different. In this case, they are calling it roll. And simply by selecting it, selecting the word roll here in the channel box and using my left mouse button, I can control that roll feature on this rig. Most rigs are set up fairly similar to this, but you might have to play around a little bit with them to figure out how they work. So let's add a little bit of foot roll to these feet here. And where should I start the roll? I don't know. Maybe I'll key the roll channel here on frame 8. We'll just try that out perhaps. And then go to frame 12 and I'll add my roll and key that. And we'll do the same on the right foot. Get rid of the roll on frame 20. And we'll play it and see how it's looking. A little bit of a problem there. Let's see what's going on with that. I didn't make the, on the right leg, frame 24 the same as frame 0 here. So let's go ahead and just fix that real quick. In case you're wondering how I'm fixing it, what I'm doing is selecting the control and then middle mouse dragging in my timeline. Notice that if I middle mouse drag, it doesn't make any changes. Even though I'm moving in time, it doesn't make any changes on the rig. If I just use my left mouse button, we see it animated. If I use my middle mouse button, I can move in the timeline without seeing any changes here. And now if I key that roll, the beginning and the end will be identical, and we won't have that problem anymore. Now, animating anything, but in particular a walk cycle, can be really challenging because you make changes to one thing and it affects another. So in the case of the hips, which we've already animated, some up and down on them, and when I was animating that, I was trying to keep the legs somewhat straight at certain points, for instance at the passing position, which they still are. But here maybe they feel like they're a little bit too bent, and some of that is because of the changes that I've made to the foot positions here. In which case then there's a lot of back and forth involved with animating the feet and animating the hips. You make adjustments to the hips, that may require making adjustments to the feet. You make adjustments to the feet, that means you might need to revisit the hips. It's a constant back and forth process here. Now, one thing I could do here is I could simply come in here and start to manually adjust these like this, maybe even key it, middle mouse drag, key it, so it's the same here. And we could come in here and just manually adjust this as well, like that. But just be aware that it'll be a constant back and forth between making adjustments to the feet and then making adjustments to the hips. Another way I could have done that, just so that you know, is I could have gone to my graph editor itself, selected the channel. In this case, it's the translate Y, which is the up and down. And of course, we can come in here and simply select the appropriate keys and move them up and down to get those fine adjustments as well. And on the subject of making those adjustments to the hips and to the feet, we should remember that the hips are not going to be animated just doing an up and down, but we can also animate them going side to side. So let's go ahead and add some side to side animation with this now. I've selected my hip control, and what I'm going to do is, let's say, go to the passing position here, and I'm thinking that when the weight is entirely off of the right leg and is on the left leg instead, then to keep the character from falling over, we might need to shift the weight over so that the center of gravity is more over the left leg. So we'll go ahead and try that out. I'll just move it over. In fact, maybe I'll go ahead and put in an exact number in here. We'll try 5. And I'll key that. And we'll do the same when the weight is shifted onto the right leg. And we'll key that. This time, -5. And we'll play it. Looks a little bit jerky right now. So, perfect time to go to the graph editor and see what's going on. That was the translate X, and here's the problem here. Hopefully you can see this. We have a slow out here, and we have a slow in here. But we don't have any slow out, slow in here. So that's what's causing that jerkiness in the movement right now. You'll see that there's that little jerk in it, a little hiccup. Let's see what we can do to fix that. So I think what I'll do here is I'm going to, with this hip control selected, let's go ahead and select all of the channels here on it. I'm going to grab them all, and I'm going to say curves pre-infinity cycle and curves post-infinity cycle. What's this going to do? This is going to play that same movement over and over. It's going to play the same animation over and over. To demonstrate, let me go ahead and just add more frames to the end of this so that you can see what's happening on the hips right now. So I play the animation, everything stops except the hips, which continue animating because I told them to cycle that animation. It's cycling the animation. Now let's set this back to 24 frames here, and we'll go back to our graph editor and take a look at what was causing that little hiccup. So here, this makes it much more evident. You can see that the trajectory of this curve, it's going into a slow in and then a slow out in the middle between these two extremes here. So let's go ahead and just select these two tangents here and move them like this so that that movement is more continuous. And now, if we play this, we shouldn't have that weird little hiccup anymore. And you can see that that has really effectively smoothened out that movement. So let's take a look at that side-to-side movement we've got going. Another way that we could look at it would be to go to Visualize, Create Editable Motion Trail. And we're not currently seeing the motion trail because earlier I went to Show and I hid everything but NURBS, curves, and polygons. But if I turn on motion trails, you'll see the motion that those hips are doing. Let's see if we can get a little bit more interesting motion on those hips. What I'm going to do is go to my graph editor. And in this case, we're talking about the translate X movement found here. And what I'm going to do is offset the animation. Let's try offsetting it 2 frames earlier. And you'll see that that gives us this interesting figure 8 movement here. Let's take a look and see how that looks. And I actually think I like that better. So we'll go ahead and stick with that for the time being at least, but that can be a very convenient way to work with your animations is by offsetting your animation keys. Now there's in fact a lot of different movement we can do on these hips. So far we've got up and down, we've got side to side happening, but we could also work with rotation. Both rotation on, in this case, let's see, the y-axis as well as the z-axis here. So let's see what we can do with that. I'm going to, I think when the left foot is forward, we'll go ahead and try rotating it a little bit in that direction. Maybe I'll try -10, key that. Go to my last frame, key just that channel, and then maybe go to frame 12 and we'll rotate it in the opposite direction. Take a look at it in our graph editor, make sure we haven't introduced any new problems, but that looks actually pretty good, and we'll test that out. In addition, we could also, of course, rotate on this axis as well, on the z-axis here. So the way I might think through this is when the weight is on the left leg, that will push the hips up on the left side. And when the weight is on the right leg, it will do the opposite. It will push the hip up on the right hip. We'll take a look at that in our graph editor. You can see that there'll be a little bit of a problem here. A little bit of a hiccup in there, a little bit of slow in, slow out where we don't want it. So we'll just adjust that, and let's see what we have here. And right now it looks a little bit funny because the upper body is not responding to the hip movement, but that could be the next thing that we start to look at. So what I'm going to do is select some of these spine joints here, 3 of them, to counter balance the hips, let's say, or to be rotated in the opposite direction as if they're responding to the hip movement. We might need to, of course, scale back some of this animation as well, but you can see here the hips are getting pushed up on the left side, so we could rotate the spine to counteract that. Something like that. And it'll do the opposite here. And for the time being, I'm going to set that to 0, and we'll set the end to 0 and take a look at it in the graph editor. We'll go ahead and cycle this on the pre-infinity and post-infinity as well, just to make sure that everything looks smooth. And I was thinking that might be a bit too much, but for the time being, I'm actually going to keep it because I think it looks like he has a really nice kind of cowboy swagger to him. So I think I'll keep that for the time being. Might scale it back a little bit later, but for the time being, let's go ahead and uh, move on. Another rotation I could do with the spine, not just on this y-axis here, but we could also do some rotation on the x-axis here. So for instance, when the left leg is forward, we could rotate on the x-axis back a little like this. I'll key that. Go to the end of my animation, key that rotate X channel, and go to our frame 12 and perhaps try the opposite. And key that. Let's take a look at that. We'll take a look at it in the graph editor real quick, make sure that it looks good. That looks like it'll work fine. I'll go ahead and do the pre-infinity cycle and post-infinity cycle, and let's check it out. Again, he has an interesting cowboy swagger to him, which I might scale back a little bit later, but I think for the time being, we'll go ahead and keep it that way. Now, one thing I'd like to point out to you about this particular rig is that there was actually an easier way that I could have done this. This is just an example of where you really do have to look at and study and learn the rig that you're animating before you really dive in there and start animating with it. So I intentionally worked with just this root control here, which as you can see affects the upper body as well, requiring me to counteract some of that movement using the spine. I could have selected this control here, which is the hip swinger channel on this particular rig, and you can see what it does. So this might have made some of this animation a little bit easier, but I wanted to work with this control instead, just because if your rig doesn't have this swinger control on it, then you'll have to do it more on like this root control, which is what I've worked with now. So now that we've worked some with the spine and with the hips, let's go ahead and move on to the arms. I'm going to pose the hands first, just very quickly. Not going to do anything too fancy with them, but we'll go ahead and just maybe put them a little bit more in a fist-like position. And we'll go ahead and start animating those arms. I'm going to animate both of them at the same time. And then we'll offset them to get the appropriate movement. So let me go ahead and, with the shoulders selected, I'm going to go ahead and key them. Perhaps we'll put them back first, like this. Go ahead and key it on frame 24, go to frame 12. We'll bring the arms forward like this, and maybe rotate them a little like this, and key those as well. This is what we have right now. And obviously, what we want to do here is, in the case of the left arm, it should go back when the left leg is forward, and the right arm should go forward when the right leg is back. So let's go ahead and select both of those shoulder controls here, go to our graph editor, and I'm going to go to curves pre-infinity cycle and curves post-infinity cycle. Actually, let me set that back. I'm going to set that back to the way it was before, just so that you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to select that right arm, and we're going to offset it by 12 frames. So here's what we have now. The left arm is looking okay. The right arm obviously has a problem. But if we select both of them and go ahead and offset the, or sorry, not offset, but select the animation here and say curves pre-infinity cycle and curves post-infinity cycle so that it repeats the animation over and over again, we'll get both of the arms swinging as they should be. Now I'll work my way down to the elbows and animate those. I've got the left elbow selected right now. I'm going to bend the elbow like this on this frame, on frame 12. And perhaps we'll try something similar with the right arm. And we'll key that and see what we have here. Do I want to perhaps scale back that movement? Maybe. And then one other critique I might have for this arm swing right now is that everything is happening at once. We don't have any follow-through overlapping action on the arms. In other words, the shoulder and the elbow are moving exactly in sync with one another right now. And there's no movement on the wrists. So if I wanted to loosen this up a little bit, I could start to introduce some follow-through overlapping action on the arms. So I spent a little more time on my animation, refining the arms, getting a little bit more follow-through overlapping action happening on them so that not everything is moving exactly at once. I'm still not entirely happy with them, and we'll probably revisit them later. But it is looking better. I also spent a little bit of time refining some of the hip movement and the foot movement, as well as adding a little bit of overlapping action on the head, as well as a little bit of a head turn as well. In addition, I selected all of my controls and I made sure that they were all set to cycle, in other words, to repeat endlessly, with the exception of the root control, which I set to cycle with offset, meaning that it'll continue going in that trajectory for as long as the animation plays. So in this case, it makes the character continue moving forward even beyond my last keyframe here. To clarify perhaps what I mean, because that might have sounded a little bit confusing, I'm going to increase my timeline here so that now we have 192 frames, and you'll see that my character just continues going. The animation just continues looping over and over and over again. And if I select my main control here and I unmute it, if you remember I muted it earlier so that it wouldn't have its forward motion. So I will unmute it. If I play it, the character will just continue moving forward. Let's take a look at that for a moment. So I'm going to select that main control, go to my graph editor. Here is the animation curve that we're talking about here. And what I'm going to do is change the setting. Instead of it being set to pre-infinity cycle with offset, I'll set it to offset, and also set the post-infinity to cycle. So in this case, the pre-infinity and post-infinity are both set to cycle rather than the cycle with offset. Okay, let's see what we get now. So what you'll see is it just continues playing the same animation over and over again, and it keeps on popping the figure back. It doesn't keep that trajectory. It gets to the end of the animation here and immediately pops the character back. So cycle with offset is very similar to cycle, just that it also has the offset, which then will allow it to continue moving forward. I'm going to set it back to cycle with offset. And you'll see that the character will just continue going on and on and on. I'll go ahead and put my animation back to the beginning and mute that once again so that the character will walk in place. And let's go ahead and hide the controls by going to Show, NURBS Curves. That will hide the controls. And I've put a light into my scene. And we can take a look once again at the animation.